A game called Mixtape released in the past week, and it was getting so many good reviews by game journalists that everyone thought, hey, it's a good game. And whether or not I actually want to play it, I think I should acknowledge the fact that there are so many reviewers liking it. Is what I would say if I was a fucking liar. I don't know what it is about whenever a game gets like a raving reviews by any sort of game journalist ever in any capacity. The number one thing that people do and people like think about is just like, what if this game is actually the most dog shit game of all time? And it's only because of the fact that there are game journalists who are saying that it's a game that they liked and thought was good. And this has been like a massive point of contention about like what is and what is not allowed to be good and like what makes a good game and what makes a bad game. And there's been such like a plethora of takes about like just gaming in general. And I kind of wanted to give my 2 cents on the matter. So like an example of this game getting a good review is from IGN right here. Now, obviously, IGN has been massively talked about as like one of the major pinnacles of game journalism where, you know, they don't give out the most consistent reviews. They don't give out like the most consistent scores of any games they played, but one of the game journalists who works at IGN gave it a 10 out of 10, calling it a masterpiece. I think it's important to cover it first before I even talk about any of this is that I think there's a massive misunderstanding about game journalism in general and like any sort of these gaming outlets that like talk about games and give scores of games. And it's the fact that not every single review is written by the same person and these gaming journalists. Like this one was written by someone named Simon Carty. Doesn't mean that Simon Carty does every single review for IGN overall. They actually have a bunch of different people who play a bunch of different games because I don't think people are able to play every single game to ever exist ever and then give a review on it. And so shockingly, different people play different games. I can assure you that there's someone at IGN who didn't think it was a 10 out of 10. So this is not like the number one, just like IGN saying, we are the bastion of gaming. This game is a 10 out of 10. It's just one motherfucker at IGN giving it a review. But for some reason, when game journalists like give a review to the game, it just becomes like everyone's common acceptance to believe that like this is the entirety of the company and every single person in the entire industry saying that this game is this score, when it's just one person who's paid to write these reviews and like that's really it. But a lot of the criticism that this game has been facing has been kind of interesting to me. I wanted to talk about it. And I'm going to say this right now. I have not played Mixtape. I don't really plan on playing Mixtape. So I'm not really going to comment on, you know, my experience with the game or like if the game is legitimately good or not. I just want to talk about if people are like putting out legitimate criticisms of what the game is. So the first big point of contention when it comes to Mixtape is that the game, a lot of people said when they play it, just feels like they're playing a movie and that there's almost like no or not really any sort of negative feedback when it comes to missing a skill check or missing an event. And it just becomes like a giant walking simulator. And so I want to play like 20 seconds out of this 3-minute clip to basically show what people are showing that like you kind of just can't fail in the game in any capacity.
I'm not going to be pressing a single thing. I'm just going to be ranting, as you can see. So this is a very pivotal part of the story where you're about to save your friend from their cop dad, or what little story there is anyway. I say this, but I don't feel anything. Mostly because there's absolutely like virtually no like character insight. You've seen some Family Guy cutaway gags of the gang hanging together, but also I don't.
So here you can see this person failed basically every single skill check and they're running through and they're kind of talking about the story of the game as well and like how it's a pivotal moment and there's kind of just like no sort of, how do I describe it, like intensity at all in any capacity. You know, it's not like you're really put up to the idea that, you know, failing matters here, especially when you don't have to hit a single skill check. And like obviously in a game, if you know it's supposed to be suspenseful and you're supposed to feel like a sort of urgency to like save your friend, you're going to want to feel like your actions in the gameplay matter and that there's some sort of like risk that you have to do while doing all of this. And if this happens, and like, yes, this is an issue with the game of not properly making it so that, you know, you feel the proper emotions when you're playing the game. And so while like that is a legitimate criticism that people are allowed to have in the game, there's another kind of criticism that goes alongside this that I do not think is like a good thing. I don't know if this tweet is like talking specifically what I want to talk about, but like it kind of just helps me segue into it. And it's by Anthony Fantano. What he basically says, so this thing is just a bad movie that you can play with a controller. A lot of the criticisms I've seen about this game is that like it plays like a movie or that's a walking simulator. And that is what makes it bad on a fundamental level. Because like there's no place where you can fail or there's nothing that you can really do wrong. You're more just like following a linear story. And that's kind of what it is. And I think if that's your take on it, that's not really the best take. There are some games that are like really good and tell really good stories due to the fact that it's just like this linear story. You're going alongside the environment and you're learning and watching a story unfold. And so I think if your entire criticism is not like the story's bad, but it's just like a walkthrough, a walking simulator, then that's just on you for not playing the correct type of game. Like if you see the type of trailers and see the gameplay and it comes out to the point where like, oh, this seems like just a bunch of walking around and a bunch of like following a story, then that's like not a good criticism of it, because that game genre is just probably not for you, and you shouldn't be playing those types of games if they're not for you. Now, doesn't mean that there's types of games that, like, you know, you maybe not the biggest fan of the genre that can be actually good. Sure, but you run the risk of that happening when you're playing a game that like seems like it is just a walking simulator. And if you're not a fan of like walking simulators, then obviously the gameplay is not going to look that invigorating. And I think a lot of people bring up like games like Journey where, you know, there's not really a lot of risk, or it's like more of a walking simulator and you're supposed to go through the environment of like why is a bad take. But I don't really know well enough about like Journey and that type of games to kind of say that's a good example. So I want to talk more about a different example of mine of like a game that I think is really good but also had like legitimately no risk to me in any capacity. I want to talk about my experience playing Okami, where I've talked about this before, but in the game that I played, in like the 20 hours that I had to go through the entire story, or maybe even less, I don't really remember. But whatever, in the entirety of my time playing Okami, not a single time did I get close to dying in any single capacity whatsoever. And so I could have said like, oh, all these like intense moments didn't really matter because I was never close to dying at all in any way throughout the entire game. But I still thought it was pretty good. I could still see the intensity. I still felt part of the story was important. And so I think like the argument of like, oh, a game needs to, you know, be difficult, or a game needs to like not be a walking simulator, or you need to have the possibility to die to make a game good, is just not a good take to have in my opinion. And instead, if you're like trying to make a type of game where like there aren't really save states or it's kind of impossible to fail, it's just you're banking a lot more on not the gameplay but the story being good. And it seems like in Mixtape's case, the story was just not good, and now that like the entire genre of this type of like low risk gameplay is not good. I think that makes sense, and I hope it made sense. But that's like one of the big distinguishments that I want to make in the criticisms of the game. Another criticism of the game that I've seen is that the company's industry plan, at least the publisher of the game's industry plan, I think it was Annapurna that made it, the game. And like this person's trying to argue that like because they made the game Cocoon, which beat, I guess, Pizza Tower at the Game Awards, that means it's the biggest industry plant game of all time, and any company or any game that was made as a result of Annapurna is an industry plant. And I don't really think that's a good case, because I feel like Annapurna's made a lot of good games that people like. And like this person kind of like gives us a list of the games that Annapurna has made. You know, you got Voyagers, Lego Voyagers, you got Sayonara Wild Hearts, you got Outer Wilds, which is a game that I really like. I think is really good. Loreline and the Laser Eyes, and about also like, you know, you got Solar Ash, Neon White, and then Kentucky Route Zero. And I don't remember what this game is. Or I don't know if I've heard of this game. But I think the argument that people are making that the game Mixtape is an industry plant because both game journalists are being good and it's made by Annapurna, which makes games that, you know, a lot of people like, is a bad argument as well. It's not really a good argument in any way, and it's simply just saying like, oh, here's a game that I don't really like, and so I need to prove to people as well why they shouldn't like it, instead of just like sitting there and like, if people enjoy the game, let them enjoy the game. If people don't enjoy the game, then let them not like the game. A massive part of this is like people wanting to dogpile on something, and where like they see some people not liking it or they see some people liking it, and they want to make sure that whoever has the inverse opinion of theirs feels like a fucking idiot and the stupidest person of all time. And I feel like this part of the Discord is really dumb, because once again, it is like what we've become, where if you don't like something, then no one else is allowed to like something. And I feel like just like doing these low blow takes where you try to say it's an industry plan is just like kind of dumb. And then you have just like the worst type of people that I want to call these people like evil people. Not this K-Med guy overall, but like this watchdog person, where the AI generated, I guess, like the loading screen of Mixtape or something with Mixtape. And you can see right here that it was bad enough to actually violate Twitter's rules of violent speech, where just AI Grok generated the characters of the game hanging themselves. So there are just some people who are completely ridiculous, and these people should not be considered useful at all in any capacity in the discourse surrounding the game. And another thing too I want to talk about as well is that people who don't like the game have been review bombing it on Steam, and they have been labeling it with a tag of like LGBTQ, which as far as I'm concerned, I don't think there's any sort of that type of stuff in the game. I don't think there's any like queer relationships in the game. I could be wrong. Once again, haven't played it, so there might be like some allusion to it, but it seems like a lot of people are just labeling it LGBTQ because they want to say the game's woke, and that means it's bad, and as a result they can like label it there. That's sort of kind of like marking and calling card of the game being bad and gay, is that they put LGBTQ, because if the game sucks, then it must be gay. And so I think once again the massive discourse surrounding Mixtape is just once again people being overzealous and wanting people to have the same exact opinion as them online on the internet, and not being completely capable of forming their own opinion unless it's like part of a massive people who have the same opinion as theirs, because they feel afraid of like forming their own opinion for some reason like that. And once again, I'm not saying that Mixtape is the greatest game ever or the greatest game of all time. It doesn't really look that interesting to me. But I want to make sure that when you have a criticism of a game, it's for like legitimately useful reasons and like for legitimately like good reasons, and not just saying like, oh, this is like kind of a genre of a game that I don't really like. And because of that, it must means it sucks overall and it cannot be good. And instead of saying this game is part of a genre that I don't like, but the reason why I don't like this game is not because it's in the genre that I don't like, but because it doesn't do a good job at telling a story while in this genre. If it made me feel more intense while I was trying to save my friend, and I felt like it was a tense moment where I was chasing to save my friend, and I felt like actually nervous, then yes, that's a good story. But because it failed to make me feel tense while I was trying to like do this big pivotal moment in the story, then that's why it's a bad game. Like that second part is like a legitimately useful critique of the game. But just saying that like, oh, it's a walking simulator or a visual movie, when like those types of genres have produced like really good games, and also it's not necessarily important for you to like be at the constant risk of dying in a game for you to like feel tense. Those are not like the best criticisms of a game that you can have. And I feel like I just kind of yap sessioned this overall and like kind of I'm taking part of a really stupid discourse about a game that I really don't care about. But I think it's more just like, once again, I'm irked by the fact that people like using these stupid arguments to make when they don't like a game and trying to spread like as widespread hate on it as like humanly possible. But I don't really know. That's all I want to say for today. So thanks for watching. Goodbye.